In the scorching deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, one of Rome's most influential figures met a gruesome end. One so terrible it would shake the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest individual, had built his fortune on the misery of others. He would, however, learn the hard way that insatiable ambition, when it overreaches, becomes its own executioner. This is the story of how the very thing that made him mighty gold became the instrument of his most terrible demise. The year was 53 BC, and Rome's expansionist ambition was at its peak. The known world was governed by a fragile alliance of three men: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his partners had built their legends on military genius, Crassus faced a humiliating truth. Among warriors, he was seen as a mere banker. His immense fortune, amassed through real estate speculation and slave labor, had brought him political influence, but not the respect he desperately craved. Crassus had watched as Caesar's conquest of Gaul and Pompey's mastery of the Mediterranean echoed in the marble halls of Rome, while his own accomplishments were measured only by the sum of his money. To be called the unnecessary member of the triumvirate was a constant affront to his honor. Most men who had reached the age of 60 would have been content with their amassed wealth, but Crassus saw only one path to true glory: a military conquest that would challenge his more famous allies. The Parthian Empire, beyond Rome's eastern frontier, shimmered as an alluring prize. This vast kingdom, stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, controlled the lucrative silk and spice trade routes connecting the east and west. Crassus convinced himself that conquering the Parthians would bring not only military glory, but also unimaginable wealth that would dwarf even his own fortune. The Senate, suspicious of his motives, refused to grant the traditional declaration of war, but Crassus pressed on regardless. Arriving in Syria as governor in 55 BC, Crassus immediately began preparations for his great invasion. He disregarded the warnings of local commanders who were well-versed in Parthian military tactics, dismissing their concerns as cowardice. Desert kingdoms had always submitted to Roman discipline and strategy. Why should the Parthians be any different? His confidence was further bolstered by intelligence reports of infighting within the Parthian court, which suggested they were vulnerable to a determined Roman assault. Crassus assembled a massive army, 7 legions, approximately 40,000 soldiers, supported by 4,000 cavalry and an equal number of light infantry. It was one of the largest forces Rome had ever assembled for an eastern campaign. Among his officers was his beloved son, Publius, who had proven himself on Caesar's campaign in Gaul. The presence of his heir provided an extra source of motivation for Crassus. This campaign would establish a dynasty of military glory. The invasion began in the spring of 53 BC, with the Roman forces crossing the Euphrates at Zeugma. The initial progress seemed to justify Crassus's overconfidence. Local settlements either surrendered without a fight or quickly fell to Roman siegecraft. The flat Mesopotamian terrain seemed ideal for Roman heavy infantry tactics, and initial intelligence reports indicated that the Parthian king, Hirodes II, was preoccupied with internal rebellions and had left the border weakly defended. However, this early success was, in fact, part of a carefully planned Parthian strategy. The young commander of the Parthian forces, Serena, was deliberately luring the Romans deeper into the desert, far from their supply lines and into terrain that favored the Parthian cavalry over Roman infantry. The few skirmishes were tactical retreats, designed to give Crassus a false sense of security and exhaust his army with grueling marches. In the merciless heat as the Roman army pushed deeper into the Mesopotamian desert, the true nature of their enemy began to reveal itself. The Parthians were not the disorganized barbarians that Roman propaganda had painted. They were a sophisticated military force, with centuries of experience fighting in the harsh conditions of their homeland. Their army was built on mobility and ranged combat, heavy cavalry known as cataphracts for shock assaults, and thousands of light horse archers who could strike from distances the Romans could not reach. Serena's strategy exploited every weakness in the Roman military doctrine. While the Romans relied on close-order combat and engineering, the Parthians favored speed and flexibility. While the Romans expected pitched battles with clear objectives, the Parthians preferred to harass and wear down their opponents. Most importantly, while the Romans assumed their enemies would eventually engage in a decisive battle, the Parthians were happy to avoid direct confrontation while slowly bleeding their opponents dry. The psychological warfare was equally advanced. Parthian scouting parties would appear on distant ridges, just close enough to keep the Roman soldiers on constant alert, then vanish abruptly before any pursuit could be organized. Supply convoys were attacked by unseen enemies who would strike without warning and melt away into the vastness of the desert. Sleep became a luxury as sentries reported strange sounds and movements throughout the night, leaving the entire army exhausted and paranoid. Crassus began to realize that traditional Roman tactics were inadequate against this new kind of warfare. His heavy infantry, which had been invincible in the forests of Europe or the coastal plains of the Mediterranean, was struggling against the heat, the terrain, and the unfamiliar enemy tactics. The cavalry force he had assembled was insufficient for the mobile warfare that dominated the region, and his supply lines were becoming increasingly vulnerable to Parthian raids that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The most critical moment came at Carrhae, a small town in northern Mesopotamia where Crassus decided to make a stand. The geography of the region seemed to favor his position. Hills formed natural defensive lines for his infantry, and a nearby water source would solve his logistical problems. Intelligence reports indicated that Cirena's main force was approaching, offering the opportunity for a final battle that would justify Crassus's entire campaign and prove Roman superiority once and for all. The Battle of Carrhae began at dawn on June 9th, 53 BC, with the Roman army arrayed in their traditional battle formation, heavy infantry at the center, cavalry on the flanks, and light troops protecting the main force. Crassus positioned himself at the center, while his son Publius led the cavalry on the right flank. In the early morning light, the army was an impressive sight. With their shining banners and polished armor, it was one of the most competent military machines the ancient world had ever witnessed. Cirena's approach revealed the true scale of Parthian military genius. Instead of a conventional enemy formation, the Romans were faced with something they had never seen before: a force composed entirely of cavalry, moving as a single living entity across the desert floor. The Parthian heavy cavalry, armored from head to toe in gleaming metal scales, formed the center, while thousands of horse archers swirled around them like a fluid, creating a constantly shifting tactical situation that the Roman commanders could neither predict nor counter. The battle began with a massive volley of Parthian arrows that darkened the sky above the Roman formation. Unlike previous enemies, who would quickly exhaust their ammunition, the Parthians had a logistical train of camels that continuously supplied their archers with fresh arrows. The Roman shields, designed to withstand blows from spears and swords, were useless against this relentless bombardment that continued for hours, slowly draining the Roman army of its fighting strength and will to resist. Young and eager to prove himself, Publius Crassus made a fatal mistake, breaking formation and charging with his cavalry unit towards the Parthian center. This move played directly into Cirena's strategy. As the heavy cataphracts met the Roman charge, the horse archers enveloped the exposed cavalry force, cut off from the main army and surrounded by enemies attacking from all directions. Publius's unit was systematically annihilated before the horrified eyes of his father and the Roman army. The death of Publius was the psychological turning point of the battle. Cirena's men decapitated the young man and, mounting his head on a spear, displayed it in front of the Roman battle line as his father watched in stunned disbelief. Seeing his son's head bobbing above the enemy ranks shattered whatever composure Crassus had managed to maintain throughout the campaign. The confident commander who had crossed the Euphrates months earlier was now a broken old man, unable to even issue rational orders. As the brutal reality of the situation set in, the discipline of the Roman army began to unravel. They were trapped in hostile territory, surrounded by an enemy who could strike at will but could not be engaged. Water supplies were running out. The dead and wounded were accumulating faster than they could be tended to, and every attempt to break out resulted in more casualties. The desert, which had seemed like a clear path to conquest, had become a prison with no visible escape. As night fell, Crassus attempted to organize a retreat towards the nearby city of Carrhae, hoping the urban terrain would neutralize the Parthian cavalry's advantages. However, the retreat descended into a rout as exhausted Roman soldiers abandoned their equipment and discipline in a desperate bid for safety. Thousands were killed during the chaotic night march, while others collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke, left behind by their comrades who could not even save themselves. The remnants of Rome's great eastern army staggered into Carrhae at dawn, having lost almost half of their force in a single day. The proud legions that had crossed the Euphrates were now a desperate crowd of survivors, their banners lost, their confidence shattered, and their commander broken by the magnitude of his grief and failure. Crassus had gotten his decisive battle, but the result had been a complete reversal. Rather than press his advantage by immediately attacking the city, Surenna chose to show Parthian magnanimity by offering to negotiate. He sent envoys under a flag of truce, proposing a meeting between the commanders to discuss terms for a Roman withdrawal. The offer seemed reasonable. Both sides had suffered losses, and the Parthians had proven their point about Roman vulnerability. For Crassus, who was desperately trying to salvage something from this disaster, the offer presented the hope of at least saving some of his men. The meeting was set for a neutral area between the two armies, with both commanders accompanied by a small team of officers. Crassus, despite warnings from his subordinates who suspected a betrayal, agreed to the meeting. His desperation to end the nightmare had clouded his tactical judgment. He needed to believe that his great gamble had not resulted in a complete catastrophe for Rome and personal ruin for himself, that an honorable solution was possible. What happened next is a matter of debate among ancient historians, but the outcome was clear enough. The meeting turned violent, with Parthian soldiers overpowering the Roman delegation. Whether it was a premeditated act of treachery or the result of misunderstandings and mutual suspicion is unknown, but Crassus found himself a captive of the very man who had destroyed his army and killed his son. Rome's richest man was now at the mercy of enemies who had every reason to hate everything he represented. Surenna's treatment of his captive demonstrated the depth of the Parthians' outrage at Rome's expansionist ambitions. Crassus was not a defeated general to be simply ransomed or quickly executed. He symbolized everything the Parthians despised about Roman expansionism. His invasion had been an unprovoked act of aggression, motivated purely by greed and ambition, launched with no respect for Parthian sovereignty or the lives that would be lost. In the pursuit of personal glory, the decision to execute Crassus in a manner that fit his character and crimes was a reflection of both Parthian justice and their understanding of symbolic messaging. In a culture where honor and character were measured by deeds, not wealth, Crassus embodied every repulsive aspect of Roman values. His death was meant to be a warning not just to Rome, but to every future invader who would presume that Parthian lands were ripe for the taking. The chosen method was both practical and deeply symbolic. The metal that had defined Crassus's life and motivated his disastrous invasion, molten gold, would be the instrument of his death. Parthian artisans heated the gold until it was liquid, creating a substance that would melt human flesh while carrying a profound symbolic meaning. The man who had worshipped gold above all else would experience the true nature of the precious metal, beautiful yet deadly, valuable yet ultimately destructive. The execution was carried out in front of a crowd of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, making the event both a judicial proceeding and a public spectacle. Crassus was forced to his knees, and Parthian soldiers held his mouth open, preventing him from speaking any final words or pleas for mercy. The molten gold was poured slowly, creating a scene of ultimate agony that the ancient world would remember and speak of for generations. The physical torment was unimaginable. The liquid gold, at temperatures above 1000 C, burned through Crassus's mouth, throat, and internal organs before he lost consciousness. But the symbolic message was just as important as the physical pain. The man who valued gold more than human life, who had built his fortune on exploitation and violence, was witnessing the true nature of gold as a destructive force. This very lust for wealth had, quite literally, become his curse, witnesses described Crassus's final moments as a grotesque parody of his life's ambitions. His mouth, which had spoken of conquests and glory, was filled with the very metal he had chased across continents. His throat, which had lectured on Rome's destiny, was rendered unrecognizable. His body, which had reveled in luxury beyond imagination, became a warning of the consequences of unchecked greed and ambition. The repercussions of Crassus's death sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world, extending far beyond the immediate military disaster. The news of his execution reached Rome within weeks, causing panic among the ruling class. They understood that their eastern frontiers were not secure, and that their enemies were capable and willing to inflict humiliating defeats on Roman armies. The legend of Rome's invincibility, so carefully cultivated over centuries of expansion, had been shattered in the Mesopotamian desert. The political consequences within Rome were immediate and severe. The triumvirate that had dominated Roman politics for years dissolved, turning Pompey and Caesar into rivals rather than partners. With Crassus's wealth and influence gone, there was no balancing force to temper their competing ambitions, and the two remaining strongmen were set on a course of political maneuvering that would ultimately lead to civil war and the end of the Roman Republic. In his death, Crassus had unintentionally triggered the very conflicts he had tried to avoid with his eastern campaign. The Parthian treatment of other Roman captives demonstrated that Crassus's execution was not simply an act of sadistic cruelty, but part of a calculated strategy to deter future Roman aggression. Many of the surviving soldiers were settled in remote regions of the Parthian Empire, where they formed new communities and eventually assimilated into the local population. These former Romans served as living examples of the mercy the Parthians showed to those who did not choose war, standing in stark contrast to the tragic fate of their commander who had initiated the conflict. The symbolic impact of Crassus's death spread across the entire ancient world, inspiring artists, writers, and thinkers for generations. The image of the richest man in Rome, having molten gold poured down his throat, became a powerful metaphor for the dangers of excessive materialism and unchecked ambition. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, used the execution as a moral lesson about the corrupting power of wealth and the inevitable consequences of hubris. While modern historians continue to debate whether the molten gold story is literally true or a symbolic narrative, the broader historical significance is clear. The execution marked a turning point in Rome's eastward expansion, demonstrating that the empire's enemies were capable of sophisticated psychological warfare that went beyond simple military tactics. The manner of his death, whether precisely accurate or not, captured fundamental truths about the nature of the conflict. The status of Crassus's remains became an integral part of Parthian propaganda. His head was allegedly sent to the court of King Hirodes II, where it was used as a prop in theatrical performances that mocked Roman arrogant claims. Some accounts suggest that Parthian actors used Crassus's severed head during performances of Euripides the Bacchae, a play that featured a tragic figure whose excessive ambitions led to his downfall. These theatrical presentations turned the Roman defeat into a perpetual source of entertainment for Parthian audiences. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield of Carrhae continues to provide insights into the scale of the Roman disaster, with weapons, armor fragments, and skeletal remains painting a picture of a professional army systematically destroyed by enemies who understood the tactical situation and the psychological dimensions of warfare. Roman military manuals were revised based on the lessons learned from this defeat, but the damage to imperial prestige was never fully repaired. The legacy of Crassus's death influenced Roman foreign policy for decades, making subsequent emperors more cautious about Eastern adventures and more respectful of the Parthian military capabilities. The disaster demonstrated that Rome's enemies were not simple barbarian tribes to be easily conquered with superior discipline and engineering, but sophisticated civilizations with their own military traditions and strategic minds. This acknowledgement marked the beginning of a more mature period in Rome's expansionist policy, one that emphasized diplomacy as well as military might. The story of Marcus Crassus serves as a timeless warning. about the dangers of letting personal ambition override wisdom and good judgment. His transformation from a successful businessman to a military catastrophe shows how individual character flaws can extend beyond personal failure to affect entire civilizations and change the course of history. The molten gold that killed him remains a potent symbol of how the things we desire most can become the very instruments of our own destruction. In our modern world, where wealth disparity and political ambition continue to shape global events, Crassus's death offers a sobering lesson about the relationship between power and responsibility. His story reminds us that true leadership is not just about accumulating resources or achieving tactical victories. It requires wisdom, empathy, and an understanding of the broader consequences of our actions. The golden throat that silenced Rome's richest man continues to whisper across the centuries, a reminder of the price of unchecked greed and the importance of knowing when enough is truly enough.